Welcome to the Healthy Compulsive Project podcast, where you can take a deep dive to explore the pitfalls and potential of the obsessive-compulsive personality, offering hope and help for perfectionists, workaholics, micromanagers, type A personality, and control freaks. Hello, everyone. Gary Trosclair here, psychotherapist, Jungian psychoanalyst, and author of the Healthy Compulsive Project book, blog, and podcast. Sometimes I'm baffled by why people do certain things that just don't make sense to me. I'm sure you can think of examples as well. How can they rationalize doing that, we might ask ourselves. But who knows? I can't read their mind. I can only ask myself why I do things that might be just as baffling to other people. It might be unrealistic to imagine that I never deceive myself. One way to start to tackle this issue is to start with one limited subject: self-deception in the service of perfectionism. How and why do we justify certain perfectionistic behaviors that don't serve us or others well? And what can we do about it? I'll share a story that illustrates this well, and then explore how this issue can show up in our lives. This is episode 60 of the Healthy Compulsive Project podcast, The Role of Self-Deception in Perfectionism. In a previous post, I sang the praises of healthy perfectionism and described how we all benefit from it. But I'm also painfully aware of the downsides of unhealthy perfectionism and how much it can dominate our thinking, feeling, and behavior, blocking out our deeper passions. One of the problems with it is that we sometimes use self-deception to justify our insistence on perfectionism. This can tragically rob us of more fulfilling lives which could be lived in service to more gratifying ideals and goals. We might like to think that we're living according to our values, but out of insecurity, end up valuing perfectionism itself instead. Bob Dylan famously sang, "You're gonna have to serve somebody." I would paraphrase him slightly and say, you're gonna have to serve somebody or something. That could be an ideal or a principle, even if that ideal is to serve no person, ideal, or principle. The question is, how consciously will you serve? Will you rationalize an unhealthy use of perfectionism, or will you adapt it mindfully for your well-being and that of those around you? One of the core tasks in becoming a healthy compulsive that I've emphasized in this blog and in my book is to identify your main priorities and values and to live in accord with them. We can either use perfectionism in the service of those ideals or allow it to use us in service of less consciously chosen goals. Far too often people lose sight of their priorities, deceive themselves, and, sadly, spend their life in service to ideals that blind them to the ones that are truly important. This point was driven home to me recently when I read Kazuo Ishiguro's highly acclaimed novel, The Remains of the Day. I'll tell you about the story and then discuss how to apply it to our everyday lives. In the novel, an English butler, whom we know as Stevens, and that's right, only his last name, is reviewing his life and service over the first half of the 20th century. He's taken great pride in his work, particularly for serving with dignity and for serving someone he thought was playing an important role in the world. Every detail of the management of the house is approached with perfection so that his employer can pursue his goals without distraction. Stevens strives to be unflappable and to override his own feelings and needs. He waits on his boss with blind respect, unwilling to recognize that he is a Nazi sympathizer trying to garner support for an alliance between England and Germany before World War II. His boss is not a Nazi himself. In fact, he looks as if he's just trying to help nations get along. So Stevens likes to think that he has noble ideals that are worth supporting. This is self-deception number one for Stevens. At the urging of his boss, Stevens decides to take a vacation. He plans a 5-day tour of the countryside. He justifies the trip to himself by arranging to call on the former housekeeper of the manor, the former Miss Kenton, with the idea that she would want to come back and serve there again. You see, Stevens has made some slight errors in his work recently, and he's decided that he needs more help on the staff to prevent such imperfections. Or at least that's what he tells himself about why he'll visit her. It's all strictly professional, of course. During his tour, he reflects on his life with both satisfaction and regrets. Much of his reflection concerns Miss Kenton. He recalls how they had tea together daily, how she brought him flowers, how one day he was sure she was crying in her room behind the closed door, but he chose to move on to his duties rather than check in on her. The reader can tell that her frequent efforts to get him to notice that there is something more than professional between them fell not just on deaf ears, but also on a heart long ago packed away into cold storage. He's always running off to serve the master of the house, too busy to attend to emotional matters. Utterly frustrated with him, she leaves and marries someone else. I suspect that most readers also become frustrated with him for his self-deception about his feelings for Miss Kenton. While some of the more compulsive among you might think it perfectly reasonable that he keep his focus on his job and continue to aspire to his ideal of serving as the perfect butler, most people would probably like to give him a good whoop upside the head to wake him up to his feeling side. Which leads to my point. Like Stevens, we can get caught serving ideals that, while perhaps not as extreme as those of a Nazi, we have the same quality of rigid control. Remember, Stevens believes that serving his boss loyally, whatever the circumstance, is the honorable thing to do, and that he had often reflected on what was most important to him. Still, he hoodwinked himself. Self-deception number 2. Had he been more honest with himself, he might have noticed that there was more than professional motivation behind his efforts to get Miss Kenton to return to the house. Had he tried to understand his efforts to get her to come back more symbolically, he might have realized that what Miss Kenton meant to him was a more emotional, receptive, and connective approach to life, the approach that was really needed to cure him of his, quote, imperfections. What he really needed to bring back into his life was a larger sense of what was important. But he deceived himself into thinking that all he needed to do for a fulfilling life was to serve a noble man nobly. Serving deceptive values. Can we ever know if we've done the same as Stevens and deceived ourselves? Is it possible to know if the standards and rules we've set have become tyrannical themselves and lead us to forget about ideals that would really be fulfilling? Here are some examples of how that happens. A volunteer begins organizing local events to promote community spirit and cooperation, but becomes irate and resentful when his neighbors don't participate. A parent focuses on their child's grades to ensure a bright future, but forgets about the child's feelings in the present moment of intense adolescent stress. A man starts a summer camp to support adolescents in open-minded thinking, free from rigidity and mainstream compliance, but becomes highly critical of any religion the campers may have been raised in or become curious about. The primary wage earner in a family convinces him or herself that earning more money is the best way they can care for their family, when what the family really needs is his or her personal attention and participation. The stay-at-home partner in a marriage manages the home and children perfectly, but withholds affection, interest, and respect from the working partner. His or her meticulous management of the household becomes a weapon of righteousness to punish their partner for their less exacting and more spontaneous approach to life. Recognizing self-deception. Here are some signs that you may be deceiving yourself about what's really important. You get defensive when your identity as a good person is questioned. You focus on one priority to the exclusion of others. You become disconnected from others. Rigidity and all-or-nothing thinking. You have fleeting fantasies about change. Depression and irritation are the main feelings you experience. And rabid seriousness. There's nothing wrong with liking having the spoons arranged in a certain way, cleaning your car every weekend, or working intensely on a project you believe in. You just don't need to justify it as reasonable or necessary, because that's what makes it rigid. It's okay to just say, I like it this way, as long as you don't impose the same standards on your family, roommates, and colleagues. 5 steps to lowering self-deception. Think of questioning yourself about who or what you're serving as a chance to unburden yourself. Admitting what you really feel and want can be very liberating. This is not a tribunal. Here are some steps to help you. Seek wholeness, not perfection. Ask yourself, what have I left out of my life? What have I been afraid to include? Understand the function of self-deception. We often latch onto tyrannical ideas because they serve a purpose. Typically, that purpose is to remedy insecurity about how lovable, virtuous, or hardworking we are. It's understandable you adopted that strategy, but it doesn't work anymore. Accept your imperfections. Perfectionism promises relief from insecurity, but actually digs the hole deeper. An honest claiming of our values as we are is crucial to breaking the cycle of insecurity and overreaching. Identify the values that you really do want to honor. Letting go of attachment to a rigidly held priority is easier when we have something more meaningful to embrace instead. Have patience. If you do recognize some self-deception in your behavior, be patient with yourself as you try to change. Misplaced priorities do not change so quickly. One of the reasons the story of the butler Stevens can be helpful to us is that we don't see him as the Nazi, but as someone who unwittingly served that ideology. We don't have to see our identity in a harsh light, but understand where we have misplaced our service and choose more fulfilling goals. Please know that self-deception is something we all do. It's very human. And while challenging it is difficult, the truth we find behind it is worth the struggle. You can find transcripts of this podcast with links to research sources and lots more at the Healthy Compulsive blog, www.thehealthycompulsive.com. If you'd like to subscribe to the Healthy Compulsive podcast, hit that subscribe button. And for a thorough guide to cultivating the positive potential of the compulsive personality, find my book on Amazon, The Healthy Compulsive: Healing Obsessive-Compulsive Personality Disorder and Taking the Wheel of the Driven Personality. And if you find any of these helpful, let others know by leaving a review. Till next time, enjoy the drive.